Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the fourth part of our Food Day Leadership Series webinars today. Today, the topic of our webinar is Tools for Policy Change, putting local and state food policy to work for your communities. And we're very excited to have some experienced and panelists on the call today, Mark Winne, Chris Peterson from Grow Memphis, and Nathan Rosenberg from the Mississippi Food Policy Council will be joining us today. My name is Catherine Castleman. I'm a project coordinator with the Food Day campaign based here in Washington, D.C. at the Center for Science and the Public Interest. And this call will be recorded, so I hope that you can pass it along to your colleagues who weren't able to make the call. A quick note on using GoToWebinar. Please type any questions or comments you have during the presentations into the dashboard you see on your screen, and we'll address them at the end of the session. We'll be sending a link with a recording and all of the slides to the registrants of this call within the week, so please keep an eye out for those. And if you have any questions, please contact us at foodday@cspinet.org. Our agenda today, I'll start out with a little introduction of Mark Winne, who's our main speaker for the day. Chris Peterson from Grow Memphis will be following up with some of his personal experiences with Food Policy Council work in Memphis, Tennessee. Nate Rosenberg, who is the chair of the Farm to Institution Subcommittee of the Mississippi Food Policy Council, will be also describing his experiences, and then we'll move to question and answer session at the end. And as I mentioned, please do type in your questions and comments so that we can pass them to our speakers and get them addressed at the end of the call. Our Food Day Leadership Series has been going on since March, and this is the fourth part of the series. I encourage you to check out the rest of our webinars, archived and upcoming at foodday.org/webinars. On July 17th, please join us for the next part of the series, Making Your Point to the Media, with Professor George Lakoff and the Berkeley Media Studies Group. Should be another great presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mark Winne, who is the former executive director of the Hartford Food System, a Connecticut nonprofit food organization, and the co-founder of the Community Food Security Coalition, where he worked as the Food Policy Council Program Director from 2005 to 2012. Mark was a Kellogg Foundation Food and Society Fellow, a Johns Hopkins School of Public Health Visiting Scholar, and a member of the U.S. delegation to the 2000 Rome Conference on Food Security. As a writer on food issues, Mark's work has appeared in the Washington Post, The Nation, Sierra, Orion, and Yes, to name a few. He is the author of 2 books, Closing the Food Gap, Resetting the Table in the Land of Plenty, and Food Rebels, Guerrilla Gardeners and Smart Cooking Mamas. Both books are published by Beacon Press. Through his own firm, Mark Winne Associates, Mark speaks, trains, and writes on topics related to community food systems, food policy, and food security. He also serves as a senior advisor to the Center for a Livable Future at the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. And Mark, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Catherine, and hello, everybody, whether it's good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's great to have the opportunity to share some thoughts and observations about food policy at the local and state level, and in particular food policy councils. I am going to give you kind of an overview of what's going on in pretty much in the world of food policy councils, where I've been devoting a lot of my time lately, and you'll get a little bit more of an on-the-ground look from both Chris and Nate following me. So if we can go to the next slide, that would be great. And probably need to just keep moving along, but we have seen pretty significant growth in the number of food policy councils over the last few years. This map, based on a census that was conducted of food policy councils about a year ago, gives you a kind of a representation of what's going on both local and the state level. Next slide, please. So again, probably enough about me, but I just wanted to add one thing, which is I'm currently, as Catherine noted, I'm a senior advisor at the Center for a Livable Future, which is at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And what we are attempting to do there is to establish a permanent program for food policy, local, state food policy, and food policy councils. That work is underway. We hope to be able to have a variety of resources available very soon, and to also hold a leadership meeting and training for people active in the world of food policy councils sometime within the next year. It's a way for us to try to provide more service and greater capacity building assistance to people in the field. Given the growth in food policy councils, we feel the need for that. So if you are looking for assistance in any form, feel free to be in touch with me. You see my email address, and you also can go to my website. Next slide, please. So what I want to try to do with you is to give you a sense of what's going on in the world of state and local food policy council, food policies, and what's the role of food policy councils? How have they been influential? How are they organized? What are they? What are the best practices? And then I'm just going to share a few resources with you as well. And I'm hoping that what we're going to accomplish today is just to give you a better sense of what they are, what kind of tool they provide you with, and whether or not you want to be involved or whether or not you want to try to organize a food policy council. I would hope that you would reach out to groups that may be involved in that work already. Next slide, please. I guess you call it a philosophical basis for food policy councils is based on this quote by Amartya Sen, that after really a lifetime of research into food economies, political economies, developing nations, famine, policy, politics, Dr. Sen came up with this conclusion that where people know what is going on in their countries, in their cities, in their place, wherever they live, where there are basic freedoms, where there is information moving around, where there is a free media, we rarely, if ever, find famine, even in a poor country. So the main determinant, really, of being able to provide for food security in any place has a lot to do with our ability to communicate, the transparency of our systems of governance, the ability of information to move, whether it's through media or other sources. And to me, that this is the underlying philosophical foundation of food policy councils. Because food policy councils essentially are a collection of stakeholders, a collection of interested people, organizations, sectors who have an interest in the food system. And by coming together in a more or less formal way, they are trying to improve the performance of their food system. They're trying to avoid problems. They're trying to anticipate problems that they can hopefully resolve before they become problems. It's a way of really collecting information, ideas, expertise, so that we can put that together in a way that's going to improve food security. It's going to provide for a more sustainable food system. It's going to address issues of social injustice. It is going to really try to also provide for a more vibrant food economy, more robust food economy, and more resilient communities. So that's why we have food policy councils, and I'll get into some of the details in a moment. So next slide, please. Overall, I see policy as one of the three Ps, one of the kind of three legs of a stool. If you're really trying to put together a high-performing, effective food system where everybody's needs, food needs and nutrition needs are being accounted for, I think you need three things. You need projects, such as food and farm projects. You need the food businesses. You need a variety of services that are everything from providing nutrition assistance in the form of, say, the SNAP program or the WIC program, to food co-ops, to farmers markets, to a long list of projects that have become more and more common in our food system work these days. Also, you need to have partnerships. We need to be putting together all those stakeholders, all those that have an interest in our food system. We no longer useful or effective to be able to work totally independently. We are looking for the development of effective coalitions or partnerships, whether they're small, just a handful of organizations working together, or much bigger and broader, such as you might find in a food policy council. Nobody does anything alone. They can do a lot more together. Then that last leg, which is what I'm sharing with you today, is the area of policy, that we're finding a lot of action and a lot of capacity within our local and state governments to be able to do more to affect the performance of our food system, to do more to promote food security and food justice and sustainability. Yes, we've had all kinds of national policy, food policy, and farm policy. Many of us scratch our heads trying to figure it out and trying to figure out what we can do to help it perform better. We're right now in the middle of the Farm Bill, and I will not make any comments about that other than to say at the national level we have really a set of policies that certainly influence what goes on at the local and state level. But so far we are just seeing the potential to develop state and local food policy as a way to really have a much bigger impact on our food system. And that is really the province, you might say, of food policy council work, trying to get government more engaged and to use the variety of resources and functions and authorities and so forth that government has at its disposal to be able to again, to affect the quality of our food system. But not to do that alone, not to do it in isolation. It's something that is best done if it's a partnership with the private sector, with nonprofits, with for-profits. If that partnership is working well, then we can begin to see government be more effective. Next slide, please. So what is it the food policy councils do? Well, one area where they have actually been becoming more effective is in this area of food system planning. If you think about it, we don't have anywhere in the country a Department of Food at a local or state level. There's no entity in place that brings together, or rather that has a sort of large food system purview, that does any kind of long-range planning, that creates a real vision for our food system. That work is left to a fairly fragmented form of government functions, whether it's a State Department of Agriculture or State Department of Social Services or Health or Education. All those departments and many more, you see versions of them at the local level as well, where you will have planning and education and health and so forth, but rarely working together, rarely looking at food as sort of a single or shared topic. And so no one is thinking ahead. No one is actually planning for the food system. Essentially, they're organized, doing their own work, often operating in silos and administering programs or regulations or attempting to work within a fairly narrowly defined mission. So a food policy council tries to break down the silos. It tries to bring all those different groups, departments, and entities together. In other words, look at all the functions of state or local government and see how they can apply to our food system. Food planning becomes one very critical area in that regard. And in fact, the planning profession has become much more engaged in food policy work over the last few years, as has the health, public health and health professions as well. They are, again, a venue to bring together a variety of different stakeholders, public and private, academic, for-profit, nonprofit, and it represents, really the depth and breadth of the food system. I sometimes get into little arguments, friendly arguments with groups about, what is a food policy council. Well, I sometimes, maybe I get a little too rigid, but I think unless you have that fairly substantial amount of diversity that does more or less represent your area's food system, then it isn't, in my mind, a food policy council, because if it's just simply focused on one area of food system activity, such as anti-hunger work or such as promoting local food, that does not fully embrace the range of possibilities within your food system. Therefore, not to discount the importance of those more single-focus, single-purpose type of entities, I like to be able to see a food policy council as having the ability to bring together a much broader range of interests. We are focusing on a variety of food system topics, health, planning, economic development, because we all know food is a big deal, it's complicated, there's lots of dots out there, and a lot of those dots aren't very well connected. We're learning more about how we can, what are the economic impacts of our food system, that it's a very large part of food is a very large part of our overall economy. We're learning about the relationship between food and health, obviously the relationship between agriculture, health, and food, and the whole array of social services which are available to help people who are not able to participate fully in the food system, or who are having adverse effects perhaps from the food that they're eating or not eating. And they're there to address really the basic functions of government, which are regulation, budgeting, legislation, and the programs and administration that are needed to make those go forward. Next slide, please. They should do two things. They should try to influence policies, and they should try to coordinate food system stakeholders. I see those as two essential criteria for a food policy council. If they're not working on policy, then they're really not a food policy council. Again, they could be something else, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I want to see that they're actively engaged in trying to influence policy. What are food policy councils not? Well, this is sort of mostly based on experience, but they should be looking at policies and not projects. In other words, you don't organize the Food Policy Council to undertake some local food project. I'll give you an example. I've seen some groups say, hey, we need a new community garden at the corner of 14th and Vine. Well, absolutely, you may absolutely need that garden, but that's not the work of a food policy council. A food policy council will say, I think we need more community gardens overall in our community. And what are some of the policy barriers or opportunities that exist in order for us to achieve that goal? And so they would look to City Hall, they would look to ordinances, they would look to regulations and so forth, and see whether or not they can be better put into service for the purpose of expanding the number of community gardens or the performance of community gardens overall. So just want to differentiate projects from policies. I also don't see them as the place where you take on the oligopolistic forces of multinational agribusiness. Those big battles, some of which are raging now at the local, state, and national levels. And I think we need to be able to, not to suggest that we do not take on those battles, but that the Food Policy Council, by dint of the fact that it's a fairly diverse group of stakeholders, isn't the best place to take on those big fights. There's a lot of other good opportunities where you can be effective. And those other battles can be fought in other places by and perhaps even by individual members of your Food Policy Council. Next slide, please. Food policy councils are created under different authorities, from those that you might say are very formal in the sense of having been created by a state statute or a local ordinance, and sometimes by the executive order of an elected official, such as a governor or a mayor. Also, kind of moving along a spectrum, you see food policy councils organized independently. In other words, they have no formal relationship to government. I do say that it's critical for your food policy council to have good working relationships with government, to have them as members, whether ex officio or otherwise, on your as members of your food policy council. But it's not necessary to have the food policy council formally constituted by an act of your local or state government. We also are seeing more food policy councils come along that are not-profit, 501c3. Iowa, for instance, went to the formation of a nonprofit 501c3 for a food policy council. It kind of points out, in a way, in the story of Iowa, a little bit points out some of the challenges of food policy, of the organizational structure. It was first established as an executive order of the governor about 10 years ago, but when the governor left office, the executive order expired, and therefore the Food Policy Council was left without any authority or framework, you might say. And the new governor that came along decided that he was not interested in the Food Policy Council, so effectively it went out of business. But the organizers were able to reconstitute the Food Policy Council as a nonprofit, and is now functioning in that way. If a Food Policy Council is created by state statute, as it is in Connecticut, or a local ordinance, as it is in Portland, Oregon, well, actually, there's some other issues there in Portland that I can't go into right now, but it tends to be a more stable and long-term proposition. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip this one. Just want to say that let's go to the next slide, but just to say that we do have information. You can go to my website, markwinne.com, for a directory of food policy councils. That's under my resource materials. Also the site that's on that slide. But we did a census a while ago in 2010 and then later in 2012, and I found a significant increase in the number of food policy councils: local, county, regional, state, provincial, tribal. And I don't want to go through all these numbers now, so let's skip ahead to the next slide, please. You can just see the kind of what the growth has been just in the last couple of years. And we can also see here a breakdown in the number of food policy councils that are independent versus those that are government appointed. Probably should say government created. In other words, yes, the members are appointed, might be appointed by government, but more importantly, it's established by some legal authority of government. Next slide, please. This is a little bit of what you'll see of the directory of food policy councils. There's just a lot of information there about their contacts and how they're constituted, some of their achievements, some of their challenges, and so forth. Let's go to the next slide. This is simply to point out that there's different names for anything in this life, but food policy councils as well. Sometimes they're not always called a food policy council, but sometimes they're called a network or they're called a system. And again, I go back to the criteria earlier, that they are about influencing policy, and they are also about coordinating a diverse number of food system stakeholders. Next slide, please. Just that food system assessment work is sort of precedes it may precede the organization of a food policy council, but at the very least it often precedes any solid action by the food policy council. And I don't want to go into the details of it other than to say that food system assessments are very important ways of gathering information about your food system and then informing the work of the Food Policy Council. Next slide. Just a quick look at how are they funded. There's a number of sources and more sources opening up. And then I'll say in all frankness that sometimes they're not self-funded. They have, in fact, have tried to cobble together resources from a number of places, and in order to keep their work moving forward. Sometimes they're very sort of bootstrap kinds of operations, but increasingly we're seeing enough interest in food policy councils from foundations, particularly community foundations, to some degree from state and local government itself, and significant in-kind support. For instance, I've seen a number of food banks put up resources in order to get food policy councils moving forward, and often to provide assistance as well once they're off the ground. We're seeing more support coming from the Center for Disease Control, or community transformation grants have been a source of funding for a number of food policy councils. Health departments as well have stepped up and provided both financial as well as in-kind support. Next slide, please. These are a few quick tips on effective food policy council work. Definitely, when you're getting started, don't go for like the biggest, toughest issue you can possibly think of. Start with some low-hanging fruit. Pay attention to communication. Tell your story. Tell the food system story. Talk about what the challenges are, the needs, and the assets, and the opportunities, and so forth. And always keep your agendas lively and interesting, and bring in outside speakers. Help constantly inform yourself and your members about your food policy, about what's going on in the community and what the needs are and what the opportunities are. And that one of the best ways to do that is just to bring in speakers. And by all means, always bring food. Next slide, please. Want to take a quick look at some of the accomplishments of food policy councils over the years now. Probably keep in mind that most of the food policy councils out there now have probably only been in operation 3 years. That's a rough guess, but we have a few that have been around for maybe 20 years. It's just a handful. Got a few more that have been around for 10 years. Here in New Mexico, we have the State Food and Agriculture Policy Council, which has been is an independent food policy council, but has very good working relationships with state government agencies. And some of their victories are to improve, to facilitate school nutrition rules for competitive foods. In other words, getting a lot of the junk food out of schools. And to be able to get rid of soda machines and bring in a lot more healthy food. Also, a significant expansion in farm-to-school funding from the state and the farm-to-school programs overall. Been a very dramatic increase there. They've also been able to direct more state resources from the Extension Service to tribal nations. We have 23 in New Mexico, and as a result, many of them are not getting any assistance at all. And they're really looking at how they can improve and bring stores and good food retail to our rural food deserts, which are a significant issue here. Next slide. Cleveland is perhaps kind of my poster child and on food policy councils. I just want to say that they really kind of have taken the whole idea from soup to nuts. They looked at how they could change their zoning in order to accommodate more community gardens and urban farms, and also change some of the regulations to allow for backyard raising of chickens and bees. They've done that successfully. They've looked at how they can use their economic development funds to promote food enterprises, including urban farms in Cleveland. And they then looked at how they can use public purchasing. They're buying tens of millions of dollars of food every year for their institutions. How can more of that be directed at locally grown food? And they've also undertaken a Healthy Cleveland initiative, which includes a significant food component. In other words, what they did is really look at all the functions of city government and thought about how they can be applied to their food system, both to promote a vigorous food economy and at the same time address a number of health-related issues in Cleveland. Next slide. Missoula, Montana has been, I bring them up because they've been very active in land use planning and have been very active in directing development proposals away from prime farm and ranch land, and have done a lot to educate the community about the need to protect farmland and ranch land and some of the best soils in the area. Next slide, please. Boulder County is an interesting story, particularly for those who are interested in the genetically engineered issue. They had quite a battle on their hands, and I can't go into all the details of it right now, but would encourage you, if you're interested in how to address a very controversial issue on whether or not to plant genetically engineered sugar beets on publicly owned land, and how the Food Policy Council can function in that kind of environment and under that kind of situation. You can take a look at what they've done. Quite an interesting story, but not a typical Food Policy Council issue, perhaps, but nevertheless one that some groups have had to wade into. Next slide. And I am getting near the end, for those of you who might be concerned about that. Let's skip this slide, please. Just to note that we do have tribal communities that are now forming Food Policy Councils. In Hartford, Connecticut, where I was working on a Food Policy Council and a member of one, we were able to had to address the decline in our WIC population, which resulted from a number of bureaucratic mistakes, ineptitudes, and indifference, I would have to say. And because the Food Policy Council was paying attention, we were able to increase the WIC caseload and be able to bring more benefits to lower income mothers. We also initiated a public transportation study that found that people were not able to get to supermarkets using public transportation, and we were able to change that and introduce new bus routes in order to help people get to food stores. Next slide. Actually, I'm just going to skip this slide for now. Just on the in terms of state food policy, just go right to the lessons learned, which I think are important here. It's important to cultivate good relationships among your members of your Food Policy Council and all the different groups within the state, with all your stakeholder groups. We have to be looking at a wide range of interests. We need to be educating the general public and policymakers all the time, talking about food systems and food security and sustainability and so forth. It's not part of our common language yet, and so we do need to be, speaking plainly and directly about the issues and problems. Again, food assessments are a very important part of the work of food policy councils. And then finding synergy between different levels of government is really important. And the Food Policy Council is uniquely positioned to do this because they're looking at all of the activities within the food system. Good leadership within the council and cultivating and champions in the policy-making arena are important steps to take as well. And just going to go to the next, breeze through a couple of resources, a great, great product out of Harvard Law School, putting local food policy to work for our communities. Good Law, Good Food series is also one on state level food policies. You should check those out. Next slide. Another, just a quick look from the at the table of contents. Next slide, please. And then also on my website, Doing Food Policy Councils Right, which is a basic Food Policy Council manual. Gives you a lot of how-to, first step, improve the operation of your Food Policy Council. And one more, go to the last, we're done. So we're going to hold these until the end. Thank you for your attention, and I guess we're going to turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Mark. And for the audience, please do type in any questions or comments you have, and we will take them at the end of the presentation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Peterson, who is the Executive Director of Grow Memphis, who's going to share some of his experiences with food policy work on the ground.
All right, thank you all very much. I'm Chris Peterson. I'm the Executive Director of Grow Memphis. I'm also currently the Chair of the Food Advisory Council for Memphis and Shelby County, and I'm also on the board of the Tennessee Food Policy Council. All right, so Grow Memphis, the nonprofit that I'm the executive director of, our main work actually is not food policy. We got into that a little bit late in the game. We were founded in 2007 by another nonprofit as their food justice wing of a community organization. We started out just doing grassroots empowerment for folks who wanted to start neighborhood food projects like community gardens. And then in 2010, late 2010, we're sort of gifted an opportunity by our local community foundation to get into food policy at a more systemic level. And so out of that, we co-founded the Food Advisory Council for Memphis and Shelby County, and our mission is to advance policy and practice in Memphis and Shelby County that strengthen food security and the local food economy. So we've really highlighted those two issues in particular as the ones that are important to us in Memphis. So food security and sort of empowering our local farm economy. So Memphis, just a little bit about the city and our county. We're consistently ranked in number 1, number 2 in hunger and obesity simultaneously, and then our state is also in the top 4 states for loss of farmland and has an extremely high rate of loss of family farms at a rate of about 1,300 per year as of 2008. So we're an independent grassroots coalition convened primarily by Grow Memphis. We were funded originally as part of the Convergence Partnership under the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which brought together our community foundation and other local foundations to specifically focus on policy. So out of that initiative, they funded the Food Advisory Council to look at food security, and then they also funded another organization that's looking at sort of general livability of the city. That initial funding was just for the creation of our council, and we created a sort of a manifesto arguing for the need for the council called Good Food for All, which is available for download at that link on our website, growmemphis.org. It gives an overview of the issues in Memphis and Shelby County, and also sort of makes the argument for why we think food policy is important. So when we formed the initial working group to build the council, we tried to draw from as a broad cross-section of our local food system as possible. And so this is just sort of the overview of what the initial working group looked like. So there were a handful of nonprofits, our parent organization, the Mid-South Peace and Justice Center, Slow Food Memphis, Healthy Memphis Common Table, which looks in particular at obesity, diabetes, things like that. We did have a couple of producers on board at the time, Urban Farms Market, which is an urban farm and market in a food desert in Memphis, Adams Produce, which is a small distributor, a couple of representatives from healthcare providers, one local business, so our local food publication, Edible Memphis, was extremely helpful, especially in helping us get our policy documents set up and out there. And then we included government from the very beginning. So we had people from our Office of Planning, and we've always enjoyed a lot of support from our local health department. We also had a couple of advisors helping us along the way. So Livable Memphis, just spoke about earlier, some of the higher-ups at our health department, and our 2 major funders, the Hyde Family Foundations and the Community Foundation of Greater Memphis. They did a really great job early on of sort of providing us access to the folks that we didn't already have at the table. You know, once we got started, we built a pretty rigid structure, partially based on the working group, and this is all outlined in our policy document. We have 12 members, 9 of which are voting members, so our government members are technically ex officio, although in practice it sort of doesn't matter because we agree to everything pretty much by consensus. And then, so the 9 seats from community, this is just the list of sort of a general guideline that we use to figure out when we need new members, where to get them from. So trying to, again, draw from the broadest cross-section of the food system that we can. The important thing about our structure is there are only 2 types of seats that are mandated by the council as permanent seats from the community section. So it's in our bylaws that we're required at all times to have at least 1 farmer represented and at least 1 non-affiliated community member. So somebody who doesn't work for a nonprofit or government or anything like that, but is just an interested community member. And this is one of the things that we insisted on as a non-sort of government affiliated council. Was it's always been our goal to have the voices of the folks that aren't generally represented in policy discussions as key members of the council, and so you know, the agricultural sector and people that are experiencing food insecurity. Like I said, so only mandated seats for those 2. And the thing we discovered really quickly is, although this formality is really nice, and because we came up with it sort of in a vacuum, we came up with all the bylaws and stuff at the beginning, the formality can get distracting very quickly. And so we don't hold to this structure as rigidly as we used to. Like I said, we pretty much agree on everything by consensus, even though we do have a structure in place for a formal vote if we need to. You know, our goal is to get the issues taken care of rather than sort of adhering to a rigid structure. Some of our past successes. So while we were being formed, so while we were working on our bylaws and our white paper and all of that, we did have a number of opportunities come up that the initial working group was able to tackle, and that the council, now that it's fully formed, has been working on ever since. So Memphis and Shelby County have 2 separate codes, 2 separate governments, even though they have overlapping jurisdictions, which causes a lot of confusion here, not just for food, but for pretty much everything else. But a couple years ago, they were unifying the development code, and we were able to work with that department to get a couple of very easy things clarified, some of that low-hanging fruit that Mark was talking about. So we were able to clarify the rules and allow for urban chicken keeping. So we're allowed now to have up to 6 chickens within the city limits based on property size, to encourage and formally allow beekeeping within the city limits, and clarify the rules around community gardening. So community gardening had already been going on in the city for a number of years under Grow Memphis, and we were able to just get some common sense things, some residential land use permissions for community gardening. That's where most of our community gardening is done, is on property zoned residential, which the zoning code didn't really allow for things like barns or sheds or anything like that. So we were able to get some of those things added in. We worked with the Shelby County Health Department to allow for chef demonstrations at farmers markets. Worked with some of our local markets to promote the acceptance of SNAP benefits, and also created a double value coupon program, so a program that doubles the value of SNAP benefits at markets. That creation of that program was sort of a double-edged sword, so that was one of those mistakes in focusing on programming rather than on policy. So at the end of the day, what happened is Grow Memphis, my organization, was the organization that got saddled with the program. Even though we love that program and it has a lot of valuable policy uses, it does create capacity constraints when the council is focusing on creating programs rather than on policy. One of our biggest projects, and Nate may talk about this, I'm not sure, but we had a partnership with Harvard Law School and the Shelby County Health Department to review and revise Memphis's Food Ordinance Handbook, which is the collection of local ordinances around food safety. All of the licensing ordinances are contained in that book. It hadn't been updated since the 1960s, and it had only been updated twice before that, once in the 1930s, and I think before that was just its creation in the early 1900s. And so Harvard Law students painstakingly went through the entire multi-hundred-page Food Ordinance Handbook and issued a set of recommendations to the Shelby County Health Department, which we've been working with them over the last year and a half to revise. And so we've cut that down to about 14 pages, and we're looking at getting that passed through our city council and county commission. Again, a problem with two systems of government in the same place, to get that Food Ordinance Handbook revised. And that was really fairly simple, but nobody had the capacity to do it on their own. Most of the ordinances conflicted with state code or were just terribly out of date, but it took getting that partnership together to really be able to go through that thing in a systemic way. Also, I think important to point out is unsuccessful advocacy. there were some major issues with the Tennessee Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program a few years back that I won't get into terribly detailed, but we did advocate for changes on the state level to change the way that program was implemented at the local level. Memphis is very unlike the rest of Tennessee in most ways, and that program was really, Memphis being in a tri-state area where our farmers are coming from other states by and large, you know, the state wasn't really thinking about that when they put that program together. But we were not successful in changing that program, but that's something that we're looking at in the future. Currently, our main priority, like I said, is to finalize the changes to the Food Ordinance Handbook. You know, we're very much of the opinion that you know, reviewing things and planning is wonderful, and creating documents is great, but that if you don't get the changes that are implied in those documents passed through some form of government, that they're not really worth a whole lot. And so we've been working still with our health department to get those changes set up. We also have a group under our council looking at land use and access. So right now they're mostly doing data gathering on trying to do a landscape analysis of the system of community gardens and urban farms in Memphis. And then from there, doing a set of interviews with those people to assess the barriers to successful urban agriculture. The reason that we've chosen that path is a lot of us have made assumptions about the important changes that need to be made in Memphis to make community gardening and urban agriculture easier, but we wanted to make sure we had some sort of formal survey in place before we did that. We're also doing a similar project with corner stores. So one of our council members has developed a partnership with a couple of the local universities that have designed a quick survey of the fresh food offerings in corner stores, and are using a class from another university to actually go out as part of their coursework and conduct these evaluations of the fresh food offerings. And we're hoping from there to understand more exactly what's going on in corner stores. You know, corner stores are often denigrated for lack of fresh food, but in reality there's been no systemic analysis of what's really going on there. And so we're hoping that'll point us in the right direction for policy advocacy. As part of that, we've been working with a state coalition and have a local wing called the Fresh Food Financing Initiative that was originally part of the Tennessee Grocery Access Task Force. The goal of that group is to get local and state incentives for corner store redevelopment for the offering of fresh food. So we're hoping that by understanding exactly what's going on in corner stores and really getting that group will be much more empowered to advocate at the local and state level to get some money to actually do some redevelopment so that corner stores can offer more fresh produce. We also coordinate our local farmers market alliance. So our farmers markets, we have about 16 in Memphis, are all under separate banners. Some of them are just individuals in neighborhoods. Some of them are nonprofits or for-profits. And so we try to coordinate them so that there's some local coordination around issues for new farmers markets getting started up, but also so that we can understand what the barriers are to successful farmers markets and can sort of be the body that's looking at the landscape of markets for the Memphis area, since there's no single organization doing that right now. We're also, as part of our ongoing work, we have groups set up to do evaluation and outreach. So we have a couple of council members that their role on the council is to work with the individual working groups that we have to integrate regular evaluation into the success of the projects. And then also a couple of marketing folks on our council are looking specifically at how we can best communicate with the community and with our policymakers. As I said before, we're also tied into the Tennessee Food Policy Council, so I've personally been involved in that as the chair of the Food Advisory Council for Memphis and Shelby County. I'm on the developmental board for the Tennessee Food Policy Council. And our goal there is to make sure that Memphis is represented in statewide policy discussions. You know, like I said, Memphis is very, very different from the rest of the state, and so we want to make sure that the views of our city are accurately represented on that council. Our future goals, stuff that we're looking at working on soon, is we're hoping to go back to the Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program that I just talked about. Where we left it with the state last time was essentially they told us, well, we understand your concerns about disallowing farmers from Arkansas and Mississippi, but we want this to be a Tennessee thing. And so if the program doesn't work right next year, we'll talk about it then. And so we've just come through last year, the end of that program's second year in Memphis, and are hoping to take it back to them and say, this really isn't working for Memphis. We're not getting enough farmers enrolled in the program because they don't allow farmers from Mississippi and Arkansas, and hopefully advocate for them to make some of those changes. The other thing that we don't currently have in Memphis that we're hoping to change is the acceptance of WIC vouchers at farmers markets. And it's a very simple application that that needs to be filled out, but the health department hasn't ever looked at that as a priority. And so because we have a trusting relationship with the health department, we're hoping that's going to be sort of a no-brainer in coming forward. And then also a perennial issue in Memphis is school nutrition and the farm-to-school movement. So there's a lot going on in farm-to-school in Memphis, but there's a sort of a profound disconnect between the farmers in our area and the school system. So the Memphis school system, and they're unifying Memphis and Shelby County schools at the moment, is by far the largest school system in the state, and as such a huge purchaser of produce. And so if we're able to get fresh produce into Memphis, it'll enhance the capacity of our local farming economy tremendously. And so we're hoping to connect up some of the farmers that are interested in that sort of thing, and the people that might be able to aggregate and distribute to the school, and then the school procurement folks, try to get them all at the same table so that they can figure out how to make that work. But that's a little bit further down the line. We're constantly just trying to learn more about exactly how that system works, and what we can do to get everybody together.
Chris, this is Catherine. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we'll have to wrap up pretty soon, so we'll have time for Nate and a few questions. So I think this is your last slide, though.
Yeah, this is my last slide. So just a couple quick lessons. When in doubt, keep it simple. Structure is important, but you gotta be flexible. Policy documents won't do the work for you. It's never us versus them with government. Democracy can be messy, but the community always knows best. So make sure you have the right community voices at the table. And the desire to learn and work is more important than expertise. So we always value sort of democracy over expertise at our council. And then also just treating the council like a community. So really building relationships within the council is important to get the work done. So that's all I've got. That's my contact information if you want to get in touch. And I'll turn it over to Nate.
Thank you so much, Chris. And we do have a few questions for you at the end. We'll either try to get those answered or send them to you so you can respond by email. And Nate, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hi, thanks, Catherine. So as Catherine mentioned earlier, I'm the chair of the Mississippi Food Policy Council's Farm to Institution Subcommittee. And I'm also a joint fellow at Harvard Law School and Mississippi State University, where my work focuses on local food system issues. And I'm based in the Mississippi Delta, about an hour and a half south of Memphis. So to start off with a little background about the Food Policy Council, it started as a small group that first met in April of 2010. They saw a need for an organization that could bring together groups that were working on food access and local food from around the state in order to set a common agenda and to affect positive policy change. And I didn't start working with the Food Policy Council until the fall of 2010 and really more early 2011. But from what I've heard from folks that were involved in the beginning is that they thought it was really important to set priorities and goals from the beginning. So by that summer, the summer of 2010, they had already had an agenda to move forward, even though they hadn't finished developing their bylaws and creating their board. And this allowed the Food Policy Council to keep the excitement and the momentum that came out of their first meeting going. The Food Policy Council is completely independent from the state government. We work closely with and have really good relationships with several state agencies, but they cannot join as voting members. And this decision was made pretty early on in the Food Policy Council's history, and at least within the context of Mississippi, this has worked out really well for the council. As I mentioned, we have a great relationship with the state government, but I think being independent from the government has also allowed the council to give a voice to sectors in the state that work on local food and food access that otherwise wouldn't have a voice. And I think perhaps it's also allowed the Food Policy Council to move forward more quickly on some issues than it would if it wasn't completely independent. And the council now has more than, well, let me back up for a minute. At the end of the last membership period, which was in May, it had more than 25 individual and organizational members. And it's continued to grow each year. There's also an 8-person board that meets monthly. And we hold quarterly educational meetings in Jackson that are open to the public. The next meeting is actually this Friday on June 21st. And of course, you're all invited. And then we also have subcommittees that tackle specific issues. Our current subcommittees are the Farm to Institution Subcommittee, the Farmers Market Subcommittee, Food Safety Subcommittee, Food Security Subcommittee, the Legislative Liaison Subcommittee, and a subcommittee called the Local Food Systems Economic Development Subcommittee, which works on economic development issues. And with the exception of food security and economic development subcommittees, which are new and just getting started, each of the committees has some important accomplishments so far. So to start with the Farm to Institution Subcommittee, we worked with legislators to create Mississippi Farm to School Week. We also this legislative session, we passed a bill creating an interagency task force, farm to school task force, that will work to expand farm to school throughout the state. We had a Farm to Institution conference last fall that brought in about 150 people from across the state and region for workshops and presentations about Farm to Institution. And we also have several online resources, including guides. And we've finished conducting one survey, and we're in the middle of conducting another survey regarding Farm to Institution. And I will give you all a link to our website at the end of the presentation if you're interested in learning more about our guides and the online resources we have. The Farmers Market Subcommittee worked with state agencies to allow farmers markets to have EBT machines. Before that, only farmers and vendors could have EBT machines, which made it very difficult for SNAP beneficiaries to use their benefits at farmers markets. The subcommittee also drafted and promoted legislation that eventually passed, authorizing local governments to fund farmers markets. And last fall, they conducted a survey of farmers market managers, which was very useful in getting a sense of what the lay of the landscape is for farmers markets in the state, and also identifying future issues that we can work on as a Food Policy Council. The Food Safety Subcommittee used to be the in-home processing subcommittee, but it's been successful to such a degree that in-home processing is no longer the issue that it was once. So we changed the name to the Food Safety Subcommittee. And they successfully advocated for new regulations and then new legislation which allows in-home processing under certain conditions without any permitting requirements. And currently, the committee is studying food safety practices in other neighboring states, because there's a perception, at least, that some of Mississippi's laws and regulations are unnecessarily burdensome. for stakeholders in local food systems. And then finally, the Legislative Liaison Subcommittee has worked with the other subcommittees to draft and eventually pass 4 bills. They've also drafted and passed a resolution, worked to pass a resolution creating Mississippi Farm to School Week. And they've successfully advocated for 2 regulatory changes as well as other legislation that the Food Policy Council hasn't written but has supported. So how have we been able to do this? I think the key component has been creating broad and deep coalitions. Our partnerships have been incredibly important to us. From the very beginning, we've made an effort. The leaders of the Food Policy Council and the leaders of the subcommittee have made an effort to include as many different stakeholders as possible, to work closely with state agencies, nonprofits, individual growers, people in the healthcare industry, and this has been incredibly important as we move forward on these issues. To get a little more specific, I think there are kind of four main things that we do when we approach a project that have been, in particular, effective. So the first is when we look at an issue, I think the first thing that we like to do is to assess the environment. So as I mentioned earlier, with both farm to school and farmers markets, we've conducted surveys to get a better sense of the stakeholders involved in these issues. We also, of course, do a lot of informal research, talking to our members, have small meetings, things like that. But the surveys have been very helpful in identifying barriers and also opportunities to move forward on policy. Just to give you an example, with Farm to School, we did a survey of food service directors in 2011, and we were surprised by the results. We expected that facilities and money would be the biggest problem that food service directors that were interested in implementing farm to school programs would be facing. But when we did the survey, we were surprised to find that most of the respondents, and about 40% of the food service directors at public schools in Mississippi responded. But we were surprised to find that most of them felt that facilities weren't that big of an issue, nor was the money necessarily. They overwhelmingly felt like regulations, both state and federal, were the main impediment to local food, to farm to school programs in the state. And so that really shaped what we did moving forward with Farm to School, and I think has been one of the main reasons why we've been really successful working with our partners to expand Farm to School in Mississippi. We also partner with academic institutions. As I mentioned earlier, I'm affiliated with Harvard Law School and Mississippi State University, and I work a lot with the Food Policy Council. And the co-founder of the Mississippi Food Policy Council, Emily Broad-Lead, is now the director of the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, which is the main academic partner of the council and completes 1 or 2 significant projects per semester. But we've also worked with other academics and researchers on a variety of issues. And we have active members from the University of Mississippi, the University of Southern Mississippi, my institution, Mississippi State University, and I think it's been really, really productive for us, and academics and researchers have been very excited to get hands-on experience working with the council. And then 3, we try to develop achievable goals. I think our goals are often ambitious, but as Mark said, small policy wins lay the groundwork for big policy wins, and that's definitely been true with us. And sometimes what appears to be a small policy win will actually be a big one. I was really surprised. So when we passed we worked with the legislature to pass the Mississippi Farm to School Week. I was very excited about it, but I was expecting it to be more of a small policy win. But it turned out to have a really important, played a really important role in the growth of farm to school in the state. The Department of Education and the Department of Ag and Commerce both took up Farm to School Week. Schools across the state really got excited about it, and we had several politicians, both at the state level and local level, do local events in their communities, and it really laid the, it not only did it encourage a lot of schools to get get involved with Farm to School, but it definitely laid the groundwork for future legislation, such as the Interagency Farm to School Task Force, which passed the following year. And then finally, as I mentioned before, strong coalitions have been incredibly important to our success. And just to go through this quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but we've, with Farm to School using as a case study, to achieve the results that we wanted to expand Farm to School across the state and to get as many school districts involved with it, and to provide them with the resources to create strong, robust, and meaningful programs, we've approached the issue from a variety of perspectives. As I mentioned earlier, we've done research and have several publications on Farm to School, which are available on the website. Again, we've conducted surveys. We focused on creating partnerships with a whole range of different stakeholders. We had a conference and then have had subsequent trainings and workshops. And of course, we've also passed legislation. So as I mentioned earlier, we have all of our publications are available on our website, and as well as our meeting minutes and several other resources, which you can check out under the publications page. You're also, if you have any questions, I look forward to the Q&A, but you're also welcome to email me at the email address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nate. And we're going to go a little bit longer, so I hope everyone can stick around. We will take a few questions that came in. So I wanted to start with a question from Stephen Billig, who asked, let me pull up his question, and maybe this is best answered by you, Mark. When farmers markets account for around 0.2% of the American food supply, do we believe that policies promoting farmers markets represent a significant tool in addressing the food challenges we have in the U.S.? And the same question for community gardens.
Sorry, you're going to have to repeat that. I missed part of it.
Okay. So Stephen's question was, when farmers markets account for around 0.2% of the American food supply, do you believe that policies promoting farmers markets represent a significant tool in addressing the food challenges we have in the U.S.? And the same question for community gardens.
Well, I don't think anyone should assume that farmers markets and community gardens and those kinds of community-based food initiatives are the answer to bringing about full and total food security for all Americans. I think they are an important and perhaps the underdeveloped tool that that we're seeing that has a number of benefits other than just providing food to people. And are we directing? Does the question mean to imply that we're directing a disproportionate amount of resources and attention to farmers markets and community gardens, in the sense that they're not able, that they will not yield the kind of benefit and contribute to reducing food insecurity in the way that perhaps another option might? I don't really feel that's the case. I think there's a proportionate amount of attention and policy thinking being directed at how do we promote more local food production and local food distribution, and that in addition to other options we might have, will collectively promote a more food secure community and country. So that would be the way I would sort of think about that question.
Thank you. And another question for you, is there a comprehensive list of best practices of food policies around the country, and is anyone working to compile model policies to share with food policy councils?
I'm glad you asked that question. Yes, I mean, there's not a, we at Johns Hopkins, I'm putting my Johns Hopkins hat on for a moment, are in the process of compiling those model policies. In fact, we pretty much have them collected. We're just getting them organized now into sort of the categories, so you can, they will be accessible and online sometime in the near future. So I'd encourage you to stay in touch with me about that. Drop me an email or whatever. You can find on some of the websites that were listed before. You can find what food policy councils themselves are doing. It doesn't necessarily suggest that that's a set of model policies, but it certainly provides you with some of that. There are a couple of other groups, such as Policy Link, provide some pretty good model policies around related to health and equity, and you'll find a couple of others along the same lines. But we again, Johns Hopkins, are trying to draw all these together into one place, and so please stay tuned.
And a question that kind of leads off of that, are food policy councils organized nationally in any way? And what do you think about having one national food policy?
No, well, the answer is no, they are not organized nationally other than through this, again, we do have one network, a very loose network. If you want to be on a Food Policy Council listserv, which has about a little over 500 subscribers right now. It's not one of these hugely active food policy councils. I think it's just about right. If you're interested in being listed there, please send me an email and I'll subscribe you. That's about as much as we have right now. We had something a little bit more coherent about a year ago, operating under the Community Food Security Coalition, but unfortunately they went out of business. And we are now trying to rebuild that sort of networking structure. Again, under the auspices of Johns Hopkins, we will be rebuilding and offering a more of a comprehensive network. Should there be a National Food Policy Council? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure I will live long enough to see that happen. I see, yes, that it would be interesting to have that discussion. There could be a lot of opportunities, but I would also see a number of very significant challenges. So I think for the time being, I'm interested in focusing attention on what we can do locally and state level right now and begin to build the capacity of those groups and that energy, harness that energy, so that we can then be more influential at the national level. That's where I would see us going and see us putting our energy in the near term.
Thank you. And two more questions I think we'll have time for probably for Chris and Nate. So one of them from Whitney Fields, she says, how do food policy councils in the forming and organizing stages know what issues to focus on that are both all-encompassing to the needs of the city, while at the same time being specific enough to develop concrete objectives? So in other words, how do you choose which are the appropriate stakeholders that should be at the table? So either Nate or Chris, would you like to address that one?
I'm happy to. So the Mississippi Food Policy Council is obviously statewide, but I think it faces similar issues. I think from the very beginning, the council has been focused on serving the underserved and most vulnerable residents of Mississippi. But in general, and so that's always at the forefront of our work, but when identifying issues to work on, a lot of it is input from our members, input from the people who come to meetings. And it's, I think it's, the members actually, we have discussions in the summer meeting. What we've been doing for the past couple of years is kind of brainstorming ideas and having discussions that are kind of focused on several different areas. So, for example, we may have a farm to institution group that kind of discusses different things we can do, a food access group, and then during the fall, the members vote on their priorities, what they think the Food Policy Council should move forward on. And then so far, that's been really effective, and people have been really happy with the results.
Okay, and a question for Chris maybe. We often have, this is from Mindy Waite, we often have trouble with people not being able to put in effort beyond the council meetings. Do you have any recommendations for sort of moving the work forward, or should we just focus on our networking in this case?
Yeah, I mean, we had a really similar problem very early on, so not getting people really to commit outside that meeting to do the work. One of the ways that we've been able to overcome that, in a large part, this is due to some advice that Mark gave us earlier, was to really start treating the council like a community. So really start developing relationships with the folks on the council outside of the council. So if people aren't really engaged outside, just getting together for coffee and getting to know them, sort of goes a long way in that regard. Just making sure you're touching base with people regularly. And the other thing is, sometimes we'll just assign people work. I mean, I think that everybody that's there, at our council at least, everybody but people on our staff are there as volunteers. And so clearly they care about the issues. And so part of what we had to overcome is being afraid to really ask people to do something specific outside. The hardest thing that the part that is difficult for us early on was, we'll say, all right, well, you're very interested in land use, so you're the head of the land use working group. And then they wouldn't do anything outside. And so we had to really sort of get in the habit of being very specific about what you're supposed to do, what you're supposed to be doing when you're not there. So, instead of saying, you're in charge of convening the land use group, going to that meeting and really coming up with some specific things for them to be doing. But I definitely think that relationship building is the more important of those things.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And thank you to all of our presenters and for being especially generous with your time today and for sticking around for our Q&A session. We will be sending the link to the recording to all of the participants today, along with the slides, and we'll be happy to answer by email any questions that we didn't get to. So thanks to all of you in the audience for participating today, and we appreciate it. Please join us for the next Food Day Leadership Series webinar on July 17th. And you can find that information at foodday.org/webinars. So thanks again to Mark Winne, Chris Peterson, and Nathan Rosenberg for being with us today.